I still remember that afternoon like it's stitched into my skin, even though, on paper, it looked painfully ordinary. I'd just come home from work, kicked off my shoes by the door, and dropped my bag in the same spot I always do. My little girl came running down the hallway, backpack bouncing, hair slightly messy from whatever chaos recess had been. She threw herself into my arms, smelling like crayons, sweat, and strawberry shampoo, and for a second, the world felt perfectly safe. Those were the moments I used to cling to, the tiny rituals that made all the sacrifice feel worth it. Back then, I honestly thought the hardest part of my day would be figuring out what to make for dinner. We sat at the kitchen table like we always did, her legs swinging, mine already aching from the day. She started pulling papers and notebooks out of her backpack, chattering about snack time and who stole whose eraser. I half listened, half sorted through the pile, separating homework from the usual chaos of half-finished doodles. I loved these little glimpses into her world. Rainbows with uneven lines, stick figures with huge smiles, suns wearing sunglasses. It made me feel like I was doing something right, raising a child who still drew happiness without thinking twice. So when I reached for another crumpled sheet and saw a cluster of bright colors, I thought it was just one more. But this one was different. Two figures stood in the middle of the page, hand in hand, next to what looked like a big green blob of a tree. There was a sun in the corner, the usual, and a bench, and scattered dots that I guessed were flowers or maybe snacks. At the top, in her shaky handwriting, she'd written, "Daddy and the lady from the park." My eyes went straight to the woman in the drawing, long yellow hair, red dress, a big smile stretched across her face. And the first thing that hit me, hard and cold, was that the woman standing beside my husband definitely wasn't me. For a moment, I just stared at the page, my brain refusing to connect the dots my heart had already recognized. Kids draw weird stuff all the time, right? Imaginary friends, cartoon characters, things they half heard in passing. So I tried to breathe, tried to steady myself, telling my pulse to calm the hell down. I forced a smile and asked her softly, "Sweetheart, who's this lady here with Daddy?" She didn't even hesitate, just pointed proudly at the woman in red as if she'd drawn a masterpiece. "Oh, that's the lady Daddy sees at the park," she said, swinging her feet like she was naming a Disney character. My stomach dropped so fast I genuinely thought I might be sick. Still, I tried to keep my voice steady, casual, like this was nothing more than a curious detail in a child's imagination. "And when does Daddy see her?" I asked, praying her answer would somehow make sense, somehow be innocent. She shrugged, totally unbothered. "When you're working," she said, reaching for a juice box like she hadn't just detonated a bomb in my chest. "He said she's nice. She has pretty hair. And she brings snacks for me sometimes." My hands went cold, trembling so badly I had to grip the edge of the table. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions at once. Who is she? How long? What else have you seen? But she was just a child. She didn't understand the weight of what she was saying, didn't see betrayal where she saw a fun afternoon with Daddy. She grabbed a crayon and started coloring the sun, humming softly, completely unaware of the storm she'd stirred inside me. Meanwhile, the drawing sat between us, that red-dressed woman staring back at me like she knew something I didn't. Something about how deeply this went. Something about how long I'd been living in the dark. I excused myself for a moment, pretending I needed to grab something from the living room, because I could feel the edges of my composure fraying. The second I stepped out of her sight, the breath I'd been holding collapsed out of me in one shaky rush. The house suddenly felt too quiet, too still, like every wall was listening, like the truth was echoing back at me. I looked down at that drawing still in my hand. My husband holding hands with a faceless stranger my daughter somehow knew better than I did. It felt like someone had reached inside my chest and twisted, hard, leaving just enough room for air but not enough for calm. And underneath all that shock, there was a flicker of something else, something sharper than grief. I tried to piece together every odd moment from the last few months, every late arrival, every tight deadline, every tired sigh he dramatized. Suddenly, they didn't feel random anymore. They felt rehearsed, practiced, like a script he'd been perfecting. The timing lined up almost too neatly. My new work schedule, his sudden love for evening walks, the shift in our daughter's stories. I pressed my fingertips against my temples, trying to steady myself as the realization formed slowly, painfully, undeniably. This woman in the red dress wasn't a stranger to him, and she wasn't a stranger to my daughter either. And that somehow felt like the deepest cut of all. I walked back into the kitchen, trying to mask the panic behind a soft smile. My daughter looked up at me with those big, trusting eyes, completely oblivious to the crater opening beneath our lives. I kissed the top of her head, inhaling the scent of crayons and innocence, and forced myself to sit down beside her. Because if there was one thing I was suddenly, absolutely certain of, it was this. Whatever was happening, whatever he dragged into our family, I needed to understand it, and I needed to protect her from it, no matter what it cost me. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning while the drawing replayed behind my eyelids like a film I couldn't pause. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that red dress, those long yellow crayon lines that my daughter swore belonged to the lady Daddy sees. And as much as I wanted to cling to denial, something inside me whispered that children don't invent details like that out of nowhere. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I needed to see it with my own eyes, needed proof before confronting a man who lied with such ease. So after dropping my daughter off at school, I drove straight toward the park she had described so casually. My hands trembled on the steering wheel the whole time, like my body already knew I was headed toward a truth I couldn't undo. The park was painfully ordinary. Bright green grass, a few worn benches, kids chasing each other near the slides. I sat in my car across the street, windows cracked just enough to let in the sounds of laughter and rustling trees. It used to be one of our favorite spots years ago, before life got complicated, before he turned distant in ways I couldn't quite name. Now it felt tainted, like I was staring at the stage where a different version of his life had been unfolding without me. I kept checking the time, watching parents come and go, every passing minute stretching heavier across my chest. My heart thudded like a warning, but I stayed, gripping the wheel as if letting go would make me crumble. 2 hours passed. 2 very long, nerve-shredding hours where I questioned everything, my marriage, my instincts, my sanity. I wondered if I was being paranoid, if the drawing really was just a child's imagination mixed with coincidence. But then I remembered my daughter's voice, the casual certainty when she said, "He sees her when you're working." That sentence sat like lead in my stomach, dragging me back into stillness, reminding me why I was really there. So I waited, eyes burning from staring too hard at a place I used to trust. And then, just as I was about to convince myself to leave, his car turned the corner. My heart stopped mid-beat, not slowing down, not racing, just freezing. He pulled into the small gravel lot beside the park, parking in the same spot he used to choose on our old family outings. For a moment, I hoped, desperately, stupidly hoped, that he was just taking a break, clearing his mind, anything ordinary. But he stepped out of the car dressed too nicely for a casual midday walk, checking his reflection in the window like he cared who would see him. That tiny detail hit me harder than it should have. He hadn't checked his reflection for me in months. He stood there, scrolling through his phone, and my breath turned shallow as I watched him like a stranger. Every gesture, every shift in his posture looked familiar, yet wrong, like he'd become someone I no longer recognized. A few minutes passed, just enough for the dread in my stomach to expand, when she appeared. The woman from the drawing, the long blonde hair, the bright red dress, the too confident smile. It was all there, exactly as my daughter had colored it. She walked toward him with a kind of ease, like she belonged there, like she belonged with him. She touched his forearm lightly, almost playfully, and he leaned in closer, lowering his head the way he used to when he flirted with me. They talked, laughed, shared that soft body language two people share when they believe no one else is watching. I felt my throat close, my vision flicker, a buzzing in my ears that drowned out every sound except my own pulse. My hand instinctively reached for my phone, fingers trembling so badly I thought I'd drop the damn thing, but I lifted it anyway, zooming in, capturing moment after moment. Not because I wanted the memory, but because I needed the truth. Each photo clicked like a nail sealing the coffin of our marriage. I lowered the phone slowly, my fingers numb, my breath shallow and uneven like I'd run a mile without moving an inch. I watched them walk toward the bench near the swings, the same bench we sat on when our daughter took her first shaky steps. He used to hold my hand there, squeezing it gently, whispering that he couldn't believe our little family was real. Now he sat beside another woman in that exact spot, smiling in ways I hadn't seen in months, maybe years. They talked closely, shoulders brushing, his body turned fully toward her like she was the center of his world. Every second felt like a small blade carving deeper into a wound I hadn't known was open. And as I watched, something else hit me. Something even worse than the sight of them together. I realized my daughter had seen this. My little girl had sat somewhere nearby, absorbing this reality with innocent eyes, thinking it was normal. The snacks, the games, the pretty-haired lady weren't coincidences, they were part of their routine. He hadn't just betrayed me, he'd dragged our daughter into a world of secrets she never asked to witness. That thought made my stomach twist so violently I had to grip the steering wheel to steady myself. I couldn't stay any longer. I didn't want to scream, or cry, or confront them. Not yet. I just needed air, space, something wide enough to contain the shattering inside me. So I started the car, driving away with trembling hands, the park shrinking in my rearview mirror like a cruel mirage. Every part of me felt heavy, but somewhere beneath the weight was a quiet certainty, forming slowly and fiercely. I wasn't going to fall apart. I was going to find out everything, no matter how deep the betrayal went. I drove home in a fog, the kind where the world feels muted, like someone pressed a hand over your ears. By the time I reached the house, my fingers were stiff around the steering wheel, my pulse still thudding from what I'd seen. Inside, everything looked painfully normal. Toys in the living room, dishes drying on the rack, my daughter humming softly in her room. I leaned against the wall for a moment, trying to pull myself together before she noticed anything was off. She deserved safety, stability, a mother who didn't crumble in front of her. So I forced a steady breath and walked down the hallway, plastering on a calm smile I didn't feel. We went through the rest of the afternoon like a script I'd memorized years ago. Homework, snacks, a cartoon playing in the background, all the usual pieces of our quiet little life. And yet, I felt disconnected from all of it, like I was living behind glass, watching myself from the outside. Every laugh she gave stabbed me with guilt. She had seen this woman, spent time around her, and I hadn't noticed a thing. Every innocent question she asked felt like a spotlight on the cracks in my marriage. I kept nodding, responding softly, but my mind was stuck at the park, replaying every frame. When evening came and he finally walked through the door, his footsteps sounded different. Lighter, almost cheerful. He kissed our daughter's forehead, tossed his keys in the bowl, and said he was exhausted from meetings. Meetings? The same lie he wore like cologne these days, familiar and suffocating. I watched him closely, studying every blink, every shift in his jaw, every tiny tell I used to ignore. He wandered into the kitchen, opening the fridge like he owned every inch of honesty in the house. He didn't look at me for more than a second, not long enough to notice the storm sitting behind my eyes. He said work had been hell, that his boss was on edge, that he deserved a quiet night more than anything. It was almost comical, hearing him complain about a day I knew he hadn't actually lived. I nodded slowly, letting him dig himself deeper into the story he'd built, a story that couldn't survive a single crack. He asked why I was so quiet, said it made him uneasy when I stared at him, like I knew something. I almost laughed at that. If only he understood how much I really did know. So I asked him how his day went, my tone sweet, almost curious, like I was giving him room to choose the truth. He didn't hesitate. He slipped right into his lies like a favorite shirt, comfortable and worn in. He talked about conference calls, long meetings, office stress, a performance so rehearsed it almost bored me. Then he said something about grabbing a late lunch with coworkers, and that tiny detail made my blood run cold. Because I had watched him at the park at that exact time, flirting with the woman in red like he was starring in a romantic commercial. He looked at me again, confused now, sensing something off in my expression. He asked if everything was okay, his voice shifting from casual to suspicious. I reached to the counter behind me and picked up the one thing I knew would break the facade, my daughter's drawing. I held it carefully, like it was both a confession and a weapon. He frowned, glancing at it, probably expecting another one of her innocent, sun-filled sketches. So I placed it gently on the table between us and waited for the truth to hit him. The moment his eyes settled on the drawing, something in his face twitched, just enough for me to catch it, just enough to confirm everything. He blinked twice, then forced a laugh, the kind people use when they're scrambling for a lifeline. He said it was cute, said she. Must have imagined it. Said kids make things up all the time. But his voice cracked on the last excuse, and that tiny fracture was all I needed to know he was terrified. He kept tapping the corner of the page, eyes darting anywhere except mine, like the drawing itself might explode if he stared too long. Then he cleared his throat and said I was reading too much into it, that I was creating problems out of nothing. Gaslighting, the oldest trick in the book. He told me our daughter probably saw a random lady, insisted it could have been anyone, and blamed me for overreacting. He paced a little, rubbing his neck, the same nervous habit he always had when a lie was slipping out of his hands. Then he turned it on me, said I'd been distant, said I'd been busy with work, said maybe she drew someone else because I hadn't been around. Hearing him twist the narrative so effortlessly, blaming me for the affair he was desperately trying to bury, nearly took the breath from my lungs. But I stayed still, quiet, watching him unravel with every excuse he threw into the air. Finally, when he paused long enough to catch his breath, I spoke softly, almost gently. I told him I didn't need an explanation. Not anymore. I told him I already knew the truth, that our daughter had seen more than I ever had, and that I was done pretending not to notice. For a second, he just stared at me, eyes wide, as if he couldn't believe I'd stopped playing along. And without another word, I turned away, leaving him standing in the kitchen with the drawing that had exposed everything he thought he'd hidden. I barely heard him pacing in the kitchen as I walked down the hallway. My mind was already somewhere else entirely. Anger wasn't the loudest part of me anymore. It was something quieter, heavier, sharper than rage. It sat in my chest like a stone, cold and steady, anchoring every thought I'd been too afraid to confront until now. I tucked my daughter into bed, smoothing her hair as she drifted off, completely unaware of the battlefield brewing beneath our roof. She looked peaceful, soft-breathed, and safe, and something inside me hardened with purpose. Whatever I did next, I wasn't doing it just for me. I was doing it for her. Once she was asleep, I sat at the dining table with the drawing in front of me, its crayon lines suddenly looking like evidence. Not childish, not naive, but honest. More honest than anything that had come out of his mouth in months. Every detail she'd drawn echoed the truth I had seen with my own eyes. The woman's hair, the red dress, the bench, the tree. I traced the outline of the two figures, and a cold certainty washed over me like a tidal wave. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to scream. I was going to expose every lie he'd wrapped our lives in. I pulled out old receipts, text records, bank statements, all the tiny puzzle pieces I'd once ignored out of trust. Now they formed a map leading straight to his betrayal, each detail clicking into place like it had been waiting for me to notice. The late-night work dinners, the unexplained card charges near that park, the sudden weekend errands he promised were for us. I lined them up neatly, page after page, until the table looked like a crime board without the red string. And as I stared at the evidence, a strange calm settled over me, a clarity that felt almost empowering. Tomorrow, I decided, would be the first step toward reclaiming everything he thought I'd never question. The next morning, while he sulked around the house pretending everything was fine, I made a call that felt like opening a new door. It rang twice before a calm, confident woman answered, the attorney my coworker swore by after her own messy divorce. I explained quietly and carefully what I'd discovered, my voice trembling just once before settling into something steadier. She listened without interrupting, asking only for facts, dates, places, the kinds of details that matter in courtrooms, not kitchens. When I mentioned that my daughter had witnessed the encounters, her tone shifted just slightly, all business sharpening into precision. She told me gently but firmly, women don't always get leverage in these situations, but I did. I drove to her office after dropping my daughter off at school, gripping the steering wheel like it was the last stable thing in my life. The building was beige and unassuming, but inside sat a woman who looked like she'd walked through hell enough times to guide others out of it. I laid everything out on her desk, the photos, the receipts, the timeline, the drawing that had blown everything open. She went through each piece slowly, nodding, making notes, occasionally sliding a form toward me to initial. Then she leaned back, eyes level with mine, and said the words that made something inside me finally exhale. You have a strong case, stronger than you think. She explained that involving our daughter, even unintentionally, gave me grounds to request primary custody and financial stability. That his pattern of deceit, documented over months, painted a clear picture of misconduct. That the house, the only home my little girl knew, would most likely remain with me. Every sentence felt like a brick being removed from the weight crushing my chest. For the first time since this nightmare began, I realized I wasn't powerless. And that realization, quiet, steady, undeniable, became the fuel for everything that came next. When I left the attorney's office, the folder she'd given me sat on the passenger seat like a silent promise. Inside were drafted documents, instructions, checklists, a roadmap to dismantling the life he'd tried to build behind my back. I ran my fingertips over the edge of the folder, absorbing the weight of it, the power of it, the truth of it. It felt surreal knowing that everything he thought he controlled was now sitting right beside me, waiting for me to act. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, the knot in my stomach loosened just enough for me to take a deeper breath. This wasn't revenge born out of rage, it was protection born out of clarity. I drove home with a plan forming so clearly it was almost frightening. I wouldn't confront him again, not while he still believed he could twist reality around me. No, I wanted him to walk right into the truth, without preparation, without defenses, without the comfort of his usual excuses. So when he asked later why I was so quiet, why I wasn't talking things out, I simply said I was thinking about the future. He mistook that for hope, for reconciliation, and the relief on his face nearly made me laugh. Letting him believe he still had control was the easiest trap I'd ever set. That evening, I told him I wanted a family night the next day, a small gesture to rebuild trust, to reconnect. He agreed instantly, so quickly it almost confirmed how guilty he truly felt. He even suggested picking up dessert, told me he wanted to show he was committed to us. I nodded slowly, keeping my voice soft, the perfect performance of a wife willing to try again. But in reality, I was already choosing the moment, the place, the tone of the truth I'd deliver. And when it came, I knew it would break him in ways he never imagined. The next evening, the house felt unnervingly calm, the kind of stillness that comes right before a storm breaks. I set the table neatly. Nothing fancy, nothing symbolic, just enough to make everything look harmless and familiar. My daughter sat on the floor in the living room, coloring quietly, humming one of those little tunes kids invent on the spot. I watched her for a moment, memorizing the softness of her face, the peace she deserved to grow up with. Every choice I was making now was for her, for the version of her life that didn't include secrets she shouldn't have witnessed. When I heard his car pull into the driveway, a strange calm washed over me, like my body already knew I was ready. He walked in smiling too broadly, trying too hard, like a man auditioning for forgiveness he didn't deserve. He kissed the top of our daughter's head, then looked at me with that hopeful, relieved expression I once fell for. He said he'd grab dessert like he promised, acting proud of himself for the smallest effort. He kept talking, filling the room with empty words about fresh starts and working on communication. I nodded politely, letting him sink deeper into his own narrative, letting him believe every inch of the illusion. He didn't realize he wasn't walking into reconciliation. He was walking straight into the truth. He sat at the table, complimenting the food he hadn't touched in months, pretending everything felt just like old times. I served him quietly, each movement deliberate, measured, building toward a moment he couldn't escape. My daughter skipped over with her drawing book, proudly flipping to a new page she'd colored. He smiled weakly, distracted, still too wrapped in his own performance to notice the shift in the air. And then, as if guided by fate, she opened to the drawing, the one with him and the woman in red, and placed it right on the table. The exact drawing I'd set aside earlier, now staring up at him at the worst possible moment. The moment his eyes fell on the drawing, his entire face tightened, not just a flinch, but a full-body jolt of panic he couldn't hide. He tried to smile, tried to act unfazed, but his hand hovered awkwardly above the page like he wasn't sure whether to grab it or push it away. He glanced at our daughter, then at me, then back at the drawing, as if the order of those looks might change what it meant. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled just enough to betray him. He said she must have mixed things up again, like she'd drawn a cartoon. Then he added that kids get confused easily, forcing a laugh that cracked right in the middle. Watching him scramble was like watching a sandcastle get washed away by a single wave. I sat down across from him, folding my hands neatly in my lap, letting silence wrap around us like a tight rope. He cleared his throat, leaned back, and said I was reading too much into childish drawings. The arrogance in that line should have surprised me, but it didn't. Arrogance was the scaffolding of every lie he'd told. So I reached under my chair and placed the attorney's folder on the table, sliding it toward him with the same calm he'd mistaken for surrender. His hand froze halfway in the air before he finally touched the folder, as if the paper itself might burn him. He opened it, and the first thing he saw was the photo of him holding the woman's hand by the park bench. His breath hitched, just slightly, but enough. He flipped to the next page. The time-stamped receipts, the call logs, the pattern too clear to explain away. Then the custody outline, the asset notes, the recommendations from my attorney he never imagined I'd hire. His face went pale, then blotchy, then something between stunned and desperate. He whispered my name, soft at first, then louder, asking what I was doing, why I was doing this, how I could do this to him. And all I did was sit there, watching the realization swallow him whole. He stood up so quickly his chair scraped across the floor, his breathing shallow, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the table. He said I was overreacting, that I was going too far, that we could figure this out privately if I would just calm down. Then he started pacing, running both hands through his hair, muttering that he couldn't lose everything over one mistake. One mistake, as if bringing another woman into our daughter's world could be minimized to a misstep. He kept insisting he loved our daughter, that he loved me, that he had simply gotten confused. His voice cracked with every excuse, like he was slowly choking on the truth he'd buried. He finally stopped pacing and turned toward me, eyes glossy with fear instead of remorse. He reached for my arm, lightly at first, then more desperately when I stepped back. He said we could fix this, begged me not to destroy our family, begged me not to take our daughter away from him. He kept talking about what he would lose, how his life would fall apart, how much he stood to suffer, never once mentioning the nights I cried alone, or the confusion he forced on our little girl, or the promises he broke without flinching. I realized in that moment that he wasn't mourning our marriage. He was mourning his control. I picked up the drawing from the table, holding it between us like a mirror reflecting everything he'd tried to hide. I told him our daughter had seen his truth long before I did, and that I refused to let her grow up thinking this was love. His shoulders collapsed then, the fight draining out of him as reality settled in like a final verdict. He whispered that he was sorry, truly sorry, that he'd fix everything. But his apology came years too late. I stepped away, retrieving the folder and telling him calmly that the process had already begun. All he had to do was cooperate. Then I walked toward my daughter's room, leaving him standing alone with the drawings and documents that showed exactly who he had become.